Good afternoon. I'm Steve Monsma, a research fellow at the Henry Institute for the Study of Christianity and Politics here at Calvin College. I would like to welcome you to the January series 2008 of Calvin College. And I would like to begin today's session by leading all of us in a prayer. We thank you, Father God, for bringing us together this day to hear about the cause of religious freedom for all faiths in all parts of the world. We ask that the day may soon come when all persons are free to worship in keeping with your leading and their deepest convictions. We ask that you will be with us as our speaker today as he shares crucial information and insights, and with us as we listen and learn, so that from this lecture today, we will become better equipped, each in our own way, to be agents of change, bringing about a world of greater freedom and shalom. We ask this in the name of the Prince of Peace, Jesus Christ. Amen. And now, Bill Stevenson, Professor of Political Science here at Calvin College, will introduce our guest.
Chris Seipel is president of the Institute for Global Engagement. He earned his PhD at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy following a decade of service in the United States Marine Corps. Currently, he serves on the board of directors of Wycliffe Bible Translators, is a senior fellow at the Foreign Policy Research Institute, a member at the Council on Foreign Relations, and a member of the International Institute for Strategic Studies in Britain. IGE is an organization that works to advance the cause of religious freedom through Christ-infused relational diplomacy. While traditional diplomacy operates in the realm of state-to-state relations through ambassadors who advance the interests of their king or president, Dr. Seipel says, relational diplomacy follows the example of Christ in John 4. If I'm into traditional diplomacy, I'm not talking to a woman in a patriarchal society. I'm not talking to a member of an ethnic group that I despise. But if you're into transforming hearts, you let God be bigger than your imagination, and you go to a double minority and engage. Thus, he says, as a follower of Christ, I'm obligated to try to find practical ways, however imperfect or incomplete they may be, to be an agent of God's grace to Christian and non-Christian alike. Following his lecture, Dr. Seipel will be available to greet members of the audience in the West Lobby of the Fine Arts Center. Calvin College is very grateful to the Richard and Helen DeVos Foundation for underwriting today's presentation. Please join me in welcoming Chris Seipel.
Thanks, Bill. Good afternoon, Calvin. Good afternoon, Grand Rapids. I am grateful for the opportunity to speak with you today. I'm grateful for the leadership that Calvin has displayed, especially President Biker and Christy Potter, who I know you all hold dearly, but is remarkable in every sense of the word. And this series is remarkable in every sense of the word. I wish I could stay up here for 10 straight days or whatever it is. This kind of exposure to the different spheres of life over which God is sovereign and already at work, with or without us, is exactly what we need to hear in America, and will essentially be the core of my message today. So I'm grateful to Calvin for its leadership, and I'm also grateful to Richard and Helen DeVos Foundation for sponsoring today. I basically have one recommendation for the next president, and that's simply this. He or she needs to be a catalyst to build and sustain communities of the willing to address the global and complex issues that we face right now. Communities of the willing, public and private, government and non-government, state and non-state. The issue, of course, is how do we do that? How do we develop communities of the willing such that there are relationships that transcend traditional state diplomacy and do things such as we do at IG, what we call relational diplomacy. More on that in a bit. That's the question that I would like to talk about. The interesting part about the question is that we're now amidst a presidential election, as some of you may be aware. And it comes at a particular point in world history. And the particular point in world history is this: there aren't a lot of people that like us anymore. That's not a political comment. That's a statement of fact. And I've traveled around the world quite a bit in the last 7 years, and it just gets deeper and deeper, the angst and the poor opinion that some folks have of us. We all know about that. We are also aware as Christians, and particularly as evangelicals, that sometimes we are perceived as political, strident, unforgiving. We really don't have a lot to do with Christ, so it seems, or at least that's how non-Christians, non-evangelicals might see us sometimes. In fact, in the Muslim world, which will be the focus of my conversation today with you as a way of illustrating and focusing what I think the next president and what we should do next, while I focus on that, in the Muslim world, they think that to be American is to be Christian, is to be evangelical, is to have the sword in one hand and the Bible in the other. Now that's a little bit over-embellished, but not much. Not much. The interesting part about the time that we live in as we think about stewarding American power and our American citizenship as ambassadors for the King, as a function of our faith, the interesting thing is that Americans are now beginning to understand that. For 3 years in a row now, a majority of Americans believe that the rest of the world views us unfavorably. In other words, it's getting through. 54% this past year understand that the rest of the world looks at us unfavorably. 37% of Americans, and this is taken from Pew Research and from recent Gallup polls, 37% of Americans believe that our position in the world is not a good one and are uncomfortable with it and how people see us. And it should be no surprise that our current president has an approval rating of 30%, and the only thing worse than our president's approval rating is the Congress, 21%. I mean, think about that. 70 to 79% of Americans really aren't comfortable with the leadership at this point in history when most people don't like us that much. So this election's a big deal. This election is a big deal. We're going to be sending a signal to the rest of the world about what we think about our future and our role on the stage. And we Christians are going to be sending a signal about how we steward this precious gift called American citizenship. The good news in all this, though, is that 73% of Americans still think that we as a country should play a major or leading role in the world. A major or leading role in the world. What does that mean and what does that look like? How do we act as agents, catalysts of communities of the willing that can address the complex issues that we now face? I think what that means is that we've got to think about who we are as a people. What is the essence of our identity? What is the essence of American power? And that's where I'm going to focus my comments today. And basically what I'm going to try and say is that I think religious freedom is the essence of who we are as a people, and that has very practical impact and effect. And in particular, I want to look at the issue of religion and reintroduction and reconciliation as lived out through our personal experiences at the Institute for Global Engagement, and how that illustrates how we can engage the world. And I'll let you draw the conceptual lessons that can be applied to other spheres of life and other issues. So that's where I'm coming from. I've used the title Next President because it's primary season and, maybe that's catchy or sexy or something. But the bottom line is we're all leaders. You're all Christian. Maybe you're not all Christian, forgive me. But Christians in particular are called to excellence. And if you're excellent, you're going to attract and you're going to be responsible for the people and the things that you attract to you. These lessons are not only applicable to the next president, but should be applicable to us as leaders. The only thing that we know for sure about the 21st century is it's not just top-down stuff. It's just not the president of the United States or the president of China doing things. There's got to be bottom-up. So you need leaders who can articulate the kind of changes that I'm going to be describing and discussing, but you also need ordinary folks like you and me, followers who are leaders in our own context, who understand and have the same common worldview and understanding and perspective about how we do these things. So that's where I'm coming from today, and that's what I'd like to address. Before we do that, though, let me say this, a little bit about where I'm coming from. We're all prisoners of our own experience. We're all incarcerated in our various paradigms, whether we know it or not. And I want to share a little bit about the experiences that imprisoned me so you know where I'm coming from and see the strengths and weaknesses that are there. The Institute for Global Engagement's been around for 7 years. We began a year before 9/11 in September of 2000. We're basically a think tank with legs. If you're feeling less poetic, as I often do as a former Marine, it's a think and do tank. And the premise is you think before you do. Kind of simple. But we Americans aren't always like that. Usually it's fire, ready, aim. And we're trying to get back to thinking before we do in a secular sense. And in the kingdom theology sense, we're trying to get back to the Great Commission before the Great Commandment before the Great Commission. Learning how to love our neighbor in a language and logic that he or she understands before we go out. Because if you can't love, don't go. That's the kingdom theology that undergirds what we do. So we work on religious freedom. We do something we call relational diplomacy. That means that you're working simultaneously and transparently, top down and bottom up. We're unabashedly Christian about our motivation. We are pluralistic in our means and ends. What we do is we work with governments at the highest level or as high as they'll let us in, and we say religious freedom is in your self-interest. This is why you should go about and allow for religious freedom. We also work with faith groups in the bottom up and with faith leaders in the local context. If you're interested in what that looks like in a particular setting, I'm not going to talk about it today, but the best example of how we do this is in Vietnam. And we were on the cover story of Christianity Today in May of last year, and that kind of details what that looks like. And I'm happy to talk about it in the Q&A, but I'm really going to focus on the Muslim thing. So that's what we do. We do religious freedom, and we try and have practical effect on the ground through local partners who actually live there, speak the language. But the other thing is we assume is you don't go before you think. Education has to precede engagement. You have to have a life of the mind, and I know that's very important here at Calvin. It's also very important in terms of who we are as Christians. Ambrose, the church father, said the most precious thing that you can give to your Creator is your mind. He said that when he was reflecting on Deuteronomy 6:5. How do you love your God with all your heart and soul and mind? You got to have a life of the mind. You have to think about the implications of what you do and how you do it as much as you can within the limited context of human understanding, but using that gift of reason. So what we do is 2 educational initiatives. One is called the Global Engagement Network, and that's designed to challenge and equip Christians about how they engage the world. We do an annual forum called the Global Leadership Forum, and we bring in different speakers, not unlike what you're doing here, and try to holistically expose Christians to other worldviews and opinions. Not to change their mind, but to help them make decisions better. So this last September, we did a Global Leadership Forum in Washington, and it was on stewarding our 3 citizenships: our kingdom citizenship, our global citizenship, and our American citizenship. And we had people like Natalie Albright and Michael Gerson come in and talk to the largely evangelical audience. It was phenomenal. It's online if you want to see it at globalchristian.org. But the most amazing part about it was that we had Muslim speakers come in and say, here's how we feel when we interact with Christians. It was just a remarkable conversation. So that's one thing that we do in terms of educating and equipping. The other thing that we do also is we set up a thing called the Council on Faith and International Affairs. We originally did this because we felt Christians were not getting their voice out in the policy circles. I went to the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, which is the oldest, and they'll tell you the best school on international relations in the country, set up in 1933 to equip how our diplomats engage the world. When I was there, I had, as a person of faith who's passionate about international affairs, I had no place or reason or mechanism or vehicle to talk about religion. And then I went to my faith community in my church, and there really wasn't a mechanism to talk about international affairs in the nitty-gritty of what policy should be in the Northwest Frontier Province or in Southeast Asia. I thought, why do these things not come together? God's in both, but I can't talk. And I can't do so in a scholarly fashion that's accessible to both scholar and practitioner. So we started the Council on Faith and International Affairs. We soon discovered that times were so desperate that God was using a former Marine leading an evangelical organization of 8 people that we had to broaden that mechanism to include all faiths. So we now have a journal called the Review of Faith and International Affairs. It's the best journal in the field. It's the only journal in the field. That's how desperate these times are. Think about that. Two different, very different worlds because we don't know how to talk about religion and politics. I'll come back to that in a moment. This issue is on evangelicals and a two-state solution in Israel-Palestine. You know, wishy-washy, easy stuff, talk about. And I encourage you to look at that. It's very important that we think through these things as we elect our next president. It's very important. It's a time of change. And as we think about these things, there are candidates of change, and then there are candidates of change. I'll let you decide who the flip-floppers are and who's the authentic voice. But this is all a function of stewarding your American citizenship if you consider yourself foremost a kingdom ambassador.